Hello and welcome to our 3 p.m. edition of Arirang News. It's Saturday, June 29th. I'm Kim Mo-gyun, bringing you a special coverage of the G20 Summit in Japan. We begin with our top story this afternoon. President Trump said he wants to meet North Korean leader Kim Jong-un at the border separating the two Koreas. Although nothing has been confirmed, South Korea's presidential office says that any new dialogue between Pyongyang and Washington is always a welcome development. Our Shin Se-min starts us off.
In a surprise turn, U.S. President Donald Trump offered a spontaneous invitation to North Korea's Kim Jong-un. On the day of his arrival to Seoul for a 2-day summit with South Korean President Moon Jae-in, Trump says he wants to meet with Kim to shake hands and say hello in the demilitarized zone dividing the two Koreas. He tweeted, "While there, if Chairman Kim of North Korea sees this, I would meet him at the border/DMZ just to shake his hands." Shortly after his tweets, Trump said this ahead of his meeting with the Saudi Crown Prince.
I just thought of it this morning. We'll be at the area. We may go to the DMZ, or the border, as they call it. So we'll be there, and I just put out a feeler, because I don't know where he is right now. He may not be in North Korea, but I said if Chairman Kim would want to meet, I'll be at the border. It's certainly, we seem to get along very well. I can tell you, we seem.
During a short coffee break ahead of the last G20 session, both Moon and Trump reportedly spoke about his tweet. South Korea's presidential office said Trump gave Moon a thumbs up and told him that they'll work together. But the White House has declined to comment about any potential meeting beyond the president's tweet. And South Korea's presidential spokesperson, too, shortly after the remarks, told reporters that nothing has been decided, but added that there's no change in Seoul's position in welcoming the resumption of North Korea-U.S. dialogue. With a tweet, Trump has also confirmed that he'll be visiting the DMZ while in South Korea, which many had speculated he would do. His attempt to pay a surprise visit to the DMZ back in 2017 was foiled by bad weather, which was too dangerous to fly in by helicopter. Both Moon and Trump will begin their pivotal diplomatic encounter this weekend after wrapping up their respective schedules at the G20 Summit in Japan. Upon their arrival in Seoul on this Saturday, the two leaders may hold a dinner banquet at the Blue House and hold bilateral talks the following day. With Trump's impulsive character making nuclear diplomacy on the Korean Peninsula all the more fluid, there's fresh speculation that Kim and Trump could indeed meet at the DMZ, making another historical meeting between the two. Shin Se-min, Arirang News, Osaka.
In response to U.S. President Donald Trump's sudden proposal to meet Kim at the DMZ, North Korea's top diplomat Choi Sun-hee said it's a very interesting suggestion. In a statement released through the Korean Central News Agency, Pyongyang state-run news media, Choi said North Korea-U.S. summit meeting at the inter-Korean border would be a very meaningful occasion. She said it could help the two leaders build deeper rapport and move bilateral relations forward. Although Choi was intrigued by Trump's invitation, she said her government had not received an official request from Washington. President Trump's planned visit to the demilitarized zone on Sunday will make him the 5th U.S. president to do so. Our Kan Hyung-woo takes us through the history of the U.S. leaders visiting the DMZ and the significance of their trips.
In November 1983, Ronald Reagan made a trip to observation post Olet just south of the military demarcation line separating the two Koreas. He looked at the north through binoculars, becoming the first sitting U.S. president to travel to the DMZ. In a speech to American troops at Camp Liberty Bell, Reagan said they stand between the free world and the armed forces of a system that is hostile to everything Americans believe in, calling them the front lines of freedom. Bill Clinton's trip to the DMZ in July 1993 came when tensions were high between Pyongyang and Washington, with North Korea leaving the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty 4 months earlier. Clinton even visited the Bridge of No Return that crosses the military demarcation line in the Joint Security Area. His warning message to Pyongyang was loud and clear. If North Korea develops nuclear weapons, the regime will be erased from the earth. 9 years later, George W. Bush visited the DMZ in February 2002, a month after he named the North as a part of an axis of evil during his State of the Union address. but Bush toned down his words after his visit to the DMZ. At a joint press conference with South Korea's then-President Kim Dae-jung, Bush said he was deeply concerned about a country that is not transparent, allows its people to starve, and develops weapons of mass destruction. He added that both Seoul and Washington have no intention of attacking Pyongyang. When Barack Obama paid a visit to the DMZ in March 2012, he told U.S. troops that the contrast between South and North Korea could not be starker, saying that the differences in prosperity and freedom between the two Koreas were striking. Also referring to Pyongyang's announcement of its intention to conduct a missile launch after it had agreed to suspend long-range missile launches in exchange for food aid from Washington, Obama warned that North Korea will achieve nothing by threats or provocations, and the missile launch would make it even more isolated than it already is. 강영우, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, President Moon wrapped up his schedule at the G20 Summit. During his three-day visit, the president unveiled his roadmap for peace on the Korean Peninsula. Our Park Hee-jun files this report from Osaka.
President Moon Jae-in's G20 diplomacy in Osaka focused on rallying support for his peace drive on the Korean Peninsula and trying to decipher North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's thoughts regarding nuclear negotiations. Early on Saturday, President Moon sat down for crucial talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin, having met Chairman Kim in Vladivostok back in April, briefed his South Korean counterpart on the discussions that took place. According to a Blue House spokesperson, Putin spoke of Kim's emphasis on the importance of North Korea's security issues in the negotiations and that there needs to be corresponding measures in exchange for denuclearization.
According to President Putin, Chairman Kim had emphasized that guarantees of North Korean security is essential, as well as corresponding measures in return for denuclearization.
The details on what those measures are were not revealed, but an official at the top office says the two may have discussed it during their brief one-on-one. This, combined with Thursday's sit-down with Chinese President Xi Jinping, might have given President Moon some pretty good clues on where Kim might stand on the nuclear front. During the South Korea-China summit, she reassured Moon that Kim is still willing to give up its nuclear capabilities and hopes to improve inter-Korean ties. From these meetings, President Moon gathered support for his efforts for peace and denuclearization from key players in the nuclear talks. Both China and Russia have promised to play a constructive role in achieving South Korea's goal. And knowing where the North Korean leader stands, this should help President Moon better facilitate the talks, particularly for his meeting with President Trump beginning today. The next step for President Moon is to relay the messages from China and Russia to President Trump. His achievements in Osaka will be determined by the message President Trump sends to North Korea during his Seoul visit. For South Korea, the future direction of talks with the North appear to hinge more on its post-G20 diplomacy. Park Hee-jun, Arirang News, Osaka.
In his last leg of the G20 meeting, President Moon held talks with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on Saturday. He thanked his Canadian counterpart for his support in bridging the gap between the two Koreas on their road to peace. Prime Minister Trudeau said he's deeply interested and backs President Moon's policies to establish lasting peace and stability in the region. Canada maintains patrol aircraft and naval vessels near the Korean Peninsula to enforce North Korea's sanctions, and Trudeau vowed to maintain that commitment to bolster security in the region. The two countries also expressed hopes of extending economic ties, including cooperation in areas such as their bilateral FTA. Trump's top nuclear negotiators are accompanying the U.S. president on his trip to South Korea. They have been voicing hopes of resuming talks with the North while urging Pyongyang to cooperate. Will President Trump go with the flow, or could he surprise observers once more with a brand new message? Our Lee Ji-won has more.
National Security Advisor John Bolton, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and Special Representative for North Korea Stephen Biegun. The trifecta of key U.S. officials representing Washington in its nuclear talks with North Korea are expected to gather in Seoul for President Donald Trump's summit with South Korean President Moon Jae-in. Nuclear envoy Biegun arrived in Seoul a few days earlier to hold talks with his South Korean counterpart, and Pompeo and Bolton are expected to fly in from Japan alongside President Trump, fresh off the G20 summit. The hawkish hardliner Bolton said earlier this month that he believes a third summit between President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is entirely possible. He said the U.S. is ready to hold a summit and that it can take place at any time the North desires. Secretary Pompeo, in response to questions on the exchange of personal letters between Trump and Kim, said a few days ago that he is hopeful it'll provide a good foundation for the two sides to restart talks. He added reports coming out of North Korea on it suggest there's a good possibility of working-level talks happening soon. Meanwhile, Biegun seemed to relay Washington's flexibility on its negotiations with the North. On Friday, during talks with South Korean nuclear envoy Lee Do-hun, Biegun said the U.S. is ready to negotiate with North Korea to implement the Singapore Agreement in a parallel and simultaneous way. Many experts saw this as Washington's effort to bring the North back to the negotiating table and narrow their gap in achieving peace, denuclearization, and normalization of diplomatic ties with the North. With President Trump to discuss North Korean issues with President Moon, eyes are on whether his message will be a rehash of what his aides have been saying, or if he has something completely new to break the current impasse with Pyongyang. 이지원, Arirang News.
After wrapping up his schedule at the G20 Summit in Japan, U.S. President Donald Trump will make a two-day pit stop in South Korea before returning home to Washington. He's set to meet with President Moon Jae-in for another round of the summit talks the following day. What can we expect from the meeting, and where is President Moon's peace process headed at this point? David Maxwell, a 30-year veteran of the United States Army and a retired colonel who served in the Special Forces, joins us live via Skype from Washington, D.C. Mr. Maxwell, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So first of all, after wrapping up a busy schedule at the G20 Osaka Summit, U.S. President Donald Trump is set to visit South Korea straight from Japan later today for a two-day trip. Why the back-to-back summits, and how do you interpret this?
Well, I think that most importantly, President Trump needs to go to South Korea, have a summit with President Moon to demonstrate the strength of the ROK-U.S. alliance. And President Trump must demonstrate the U.S. commitment to the alliance, our strategic reassurance, and our strategic resolve to maintain peace and security on the Korean Peninsula, especially in light of President Xi's visit to Kim last week. It is especially important that the ROK-U.S. alliance be strong and that there be no daylight between President Trump and President Moon.
Earlier this week, President Trump said he won't be meeting North Korean leader Kim Jong-un during his trip to Seoul, but he hinted at a possibility of reaching out to Kim in a, quote, different form. But just a few hours ago, Trump tweeted that he's looking forward to saying hello to Kim during his visit to the DMZ. What do you think he means by this?
Well, President Trump definitely demonstrated a different form of communication through his Twitter message tonight. I think he is certainly building up suspense and excitement. It will be very interesting to see if there's been any coordination for Kim Jong-un to actually meet him in the joint security area at Panmunjom. And I think this is really part of President Trump's negotiating style and his personal style to engage in very unique ways. We should remember that he is practicing what I like to call unconventional, experimental, top-down diplomacy. And he's now engaged with Kim Jong-un twice and maybe a third time. And we have to wait and see what happens when he travels to the DMZ.
Now, David, after Trump and Kim Jong-un exchanged personal letters recently, there's some anticipation that dialogue could resume between the two sides. But that was followed by a scathing attack on the U.S. by a senior North Korean official who said talks are out of the question unless Washington changes its course. How do you personally rate the possibility of a third summit between the two countries? And what might come out of that meeting if it does take place?
I think there is certainly potential for a third summit. I think actually both President Trump and Kim Jong-un want a third summit. I think that's the way they negotiate. Certainly, Kim Jong-un believes that he can deal directly with President Trump, and President Trump is probably his best option to get a deal. However, I don't think it's likely that anything substantive will come out of a third summit unless there are working level negotiations. And this is the real problem. The working level negotiators need to lay out first a common definition, agreed upon definition of denuclearization, a framework for denuclearization, and then a path to denuclearization that is verifiable and will result in the true denuclearization of North Korea. So unless working level negotiations happen, we will have another summit. They will engage with each other, but it is doubtful that any substantive agreement will come out of it.
David Maxwell, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. The much-anticipated U.S.-China trade talks between Presidents Donald Trump and Xi Jinping took place earlier this Saturday on the sidelines of the G20 Summit in Osaka. For the latest, we have our business correspondent Kim Hae-sung on the line. Hae-sung, how did the discussions go?
Well, again, the trade talks began around 11:30 a.m. Korea time and lasted for around 60 minutes, ending earlier than the scheduled 90 minutes. Following their talks, Trump told reporters he had a very good, excellent meeting with Xi, saying they're right back on track and the negotiations would continue. China's state-run Xinhua news agency reported the two sides agreed to restart trade negotiations that broke down in May and that the U.S. will not impose any new tariffs on Chinese goods at this time. Just to recap, the participants at today's meeting included Presidents Trump and Xi, U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Chinese Vice Premier Liu He. More details will be out at 3:30 p.m. Korea time. That's about 10 minutes from now, when Trump makes a statement regarding the talks during a press conference in Osaka. What I can say for now is the results of the talks are in line with what many experts had predicted, that there would be an agreement to temporarily pause any trade war escalation and they would stop imposing tariffs on one another. Since the talks collapsed last month, Trump has raised tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese goods from 10 to 25%, threatening to impose another 10% on remaining imports from China. That's about $300 billion. But with the trade truce today, the tariffs imposed on one another remains at $360 billion. Well, that's all I have for now. I'll have the latest in our next newscast. Back to you, Mogyeon.
Thank you for that, Hae-sung. Please keep us updated. The latest summit between the U.S. and China comes in the midst of an almost year-long trade war. Our Ko Ryun-hee walks us through the timeline of the trade conflict between the world's two biggest economies.
The writing was on the wall even before President Trump took office. Back in 2016 at a rally in Indiana, Trump, the presidential candidate, signaled a possible trade war with China, saying, quote, "We can't continue to allow China to rape our country." After Trump became president, he started using tariffs as a means to reduce U.S. trade deficits with China, which amounted to around $420 billion last year. In January 2018, Trump slapped tariffs on imported washing machine and solar panels, including those from China. China retaliated in April by imposing tariffs on about $3 billion worth of American goods. Although the two sides met for high-level trade talks in May, they could not find a resolution to the dispute. Trade tensions between the two countries have steadily risen since the second half of 2018. Washington and Beijing each imposed tariffs on $360 billion worth of one another's goods between last July and early June. Products affected by tariffs include vegetables, clothing, and machinery. Analysts say the trade war has hurt Beijing's coffers more than it has Washington, given that China's exports to the U.S. was more than quadruple than that of shipments going the other way in 2018. And China's GDP growth has been signaling the impact. Last year, the Chinese economy grew by 6.6%, its slowest pace since 1990. On the other hand, the U.S. posted a GDP growth of 2.9% in 2018, the best annual gain since 2015. The trade spat has also led to uncertainties in the global financial markets, dashing investor confidence around the world. Ko Ryun-hee, Arirang News.
The Trump administration's blacklisting of Chinese tech giant Huawei has been a major source of trade tensions between Washington and Beijing. The fallout has hurt many economies around the world, and among the hardest hit is South Korea and its exporting firms. Our Kim Dami explains.
Sandwiched between the two economic superpowers, South Korean firms are reeling into the aftermath of the U.S. ban on Huawei products. In response to Trump's blacklisting of Huawei, the Chinese tech giant reportedly warned numerous IT companies of dire consequences if they cooperate with the ban. The warning extends to South Korea's IT powerhouses, including Samsung Electronics and SK hynix. Considering their high level of dependence on Huawei, Beijing's warning is not to be trifled with. Huawei accounts for 12% of SK hynix's total revenues, some $4 billion worth of semiconductors like NAND flash memory chips. Huawei is also a loyal customer of Samsung Electronics, especially in semiconductors and displays. Huawei's recent struggles in the mobile phone sector could lead to a falling demand, which in turn translates into falling chip prices as semiconductor inventories pile up. And it's not just Korea's bread and butter semiconductor industry that is being threatened. If Apple's iPhone sales drop in China due to the effects of the USChina trade war, Korean camera module products and OLED panels supplied to Apple will also be cut dramatically. Numerous mid-sized companies in South Korea rely on the export of electronic components and communication equipment to Huawei. Analysts say the fortunes of South Korean firms, both big and small, hinge on the outcome of the trade talks between Washington and Beijing. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
The highly anticipated trade talks at the G20 Summit between the world's two largest economies, U.S. and China, just ended a few hours ago. Reports say the two sides are set to make a joint statement in the coming hour. But in the meantime, President Trump announced that negotiations with Beijing are back on track. For an in-depth analysis on the latest discussions and how things are expected to unfold from here on out, we're joined here in the studio by economics professor Yang Jun-seok from the Catholic University of Korea. Professor, thank you for coming in.
Happy to be here.
Now, let's start right away. So now that the hour-long Trump-Xi summit has concluded, with President Trump keeping the door open for future discussions, what can we expect from the joint statement that's going to be released soon? Okay, well, most people have expected what's called a ceasefire or a standstill. That means that the current tariffs will remain on both sides, but no new tariffs or no new sanctions will be issued. And that seems to be what is happening right now, because there already has been an announcement by the Chinese press that there will be no additional tariffs on Chinese imports from the United States. Having said that, I don't expect that much detail on Huawei, because, well, the reason that Huawei products were sanctioned was under national security provisions, and that is, I don't think, going to be eligible for a deal between Presidents Trump and Xi, because it's going to need approval from the U.S. Congress as well as the U.S. defense components. So I don't expect anything on the Huawei front. What I do expect from the tweets that's been announced so far is that there will be a schedule for negotiations, a concrete timeline with certain targets that has to be met, and some kind of provisions on what would happen if those targets are not met. So just like you said, President Trump said that no more tariffs would be imposed, and you're thinking that some specific timeline could come out from this joint statement. As an economics expert, how do you evaluate the latest announcement? Okay, well, I think this is about the best that we can expect from this summit. There has been no working level meetings for most part of May and June, so I don't think they're going to have a lot of details worked out. And then in addition, no one expected the trade war to end during this meeting. The issues are just too deep. There's a lot of structural issues on China that cannot be solved by a one-hour conference. So I think further negotiations and standstill was about the best that we could have expected from this meeting. So it seems like you're saying that it's kind of a positive outcome. We still have to wait and see what the two leaders would say in their statement. But in the meantime, how much of an impact could this positive aura impact the global economy?
Well, IMF had estimated that if the trade war has worsened, then the next year's growth would have fallen, global growth would have fallen by 0.5%, most of it hitting U.S. and China. Now, that has been delayed and hopefully eliminated if they can get a good agreement out of this. And then from Korea's point of view, trade war was expected to cost about between 0.8% to 1.2% of Korean exports total. And chances of that hitting the Korean economy has weakened. However, we should emphasize that right now, they agreed to negotiate further. They have not come to a permanent solution. So it will depend on what kind of solution we get at the end. And another problem that we should be watching out for, two problems. One is the Korean export to China fallen about 15% so far this year. And that's not only because of the trade war, but because the Chinese economy is slowing down. So even if things in the trade war goes well, we will still have a reduction of exports to China. And then secondly, if the trade war between U.S. and China slows down, that may give more incentive for President Trump to play up the automobile tariffs, which are expected to hit Korea a lot worse than the U.S.-China trade war. So those two, I think, we still have to watch out for. But still, having come to a standstill means it won't get worse. So I think that we can take that as good news.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for now, but thank you so much for your insights, Professor.
Thank you.
And this is where we conclude the show for now, but do stay tuned to Arirang News. We'll have more updates coming in our later newscasts. Thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.